released in 1964 and was the third film in this first series of movies made about Miss Marple. All the usual suspects appear: Margaret Rutherford, Stringer Davis, and Charles Tingwell, and the film was made under the steady hand of director George Pollock. After sitting on the jury for a murder case, Miss Marple subsequently hangs the jury and sets out to figure out who really committed the murder. This leads her to join a repertory company to get close to the suspects as only she can. If you've watched my reviews of the previous two entries in this series, Murder, She Said and Murder at the Gallop, you know I love them both. But what I had noted in my last review was the very set formula that each of those films followed, and I was curious if that would carry through in this next movie. And it doesn't, which I was very happy with. There was nothing wrong with that formula, and I wonder if the reason for sticking to it so closely in the second film was the 2-year gap between the first and second movies. I have nothing to base this on other than my own guess, but I suspect the first film did fairly well, and they figured, why not repeat what worked last time, get the public reintroduced to Miss Marple on the screen, and then they cranked out the next 3 in quick succession. There are similarities, and I'm glad that those were included, but I'll get to them in a little bit. Also, before I delve into the movie, Murder Most Foul was loosely based on the Poirot novel Mrs. McGinty's Dead. Again, they did a detective swap and mostly did their own thing with the material, but none of that is a surprise at this point. So, the opening scene was great. It does not include Miss Marple discovering a dead body or witnessing a murder as the last two did, but does carry forward that perfect mix of comedy and suspense that is a constant in the whole series and in this movie in particular. Some of the comedy does feel a little more broad this time around, beginning with the cop wandering the streets at night, and that visual of a woman being strangled, silhouetted against a window, was somewhat shocking, as well as what follows. The same woman, now hanging from a noose, her body in shadow slowly swaying. In amongst the fun moments, George Pollock knows how to slip in images and scenes that stand out as being fairly violent or unsettling. But after that, the transition from the policeman saying, "What's going on here?" with a sudden cut to the courtroom where the case is being tried was excellent. As was the zoom in on Miss Marple sitting on the jury as the title card fades in, and with it, Ron Goodwin's fantastic main theme kicks in. Let's just talk about the score right away, because Ron Goodwin's music is one of my favorite elements in these movies. In the opening act, the main Miss Marple theme is used a bit more, but overall I felt that it was used more sparingly this time around. I don't want to complain too much, the rest of the score is really good too, but I just can't help smiling every time that theme starts playing. So the more it pops up, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Ron Goodwin does introduce more themes and tracks that were written specifically for this movie, and they have the feel of the main theme. They use some of the same motifs, while at the same time going in a different direction. But back to the opening scenes. I love the whole idea of Miss Marple on a jury. It's only a brief portion of the movie, but it's a great, unusual way to start off the story. Rather than her stumbling across a case, she's legitimately brought into it by being selected for jury duty. The scene where she is happily knitting away, it helps her concentrate, she says, while the judge gets very annoyed, was a nice nod to the more passive Miss Marple of the books. Margaret Rutherford is, again, terrific in the role. The more I watch of her, the more I recognize the same tricks or expressions that she will use. There's a list of tics that Miss Marple has with her mouth, her tongue, or a sudden turn of her head that Margaret Rutherford has compiled and uses regularly. I think you can feel her leaning even more into the comedic side this time, especially early on, but that's just to say that her portrayal is very consistent and goes a long way to establishing that tonal balance that the movie strikes. I don't think anyone else could play Miss Marple in this way without playing up the quirkiness too much or just playing her as a joke. It's fascinating to me to remember that this was the first version of Miss Marple that audiences saw on screen. Now we can all look at the variety of actresses that have played her and compare and contrast their performances, their accuracy to the books, etc. But for nearly 20 years, until Angela Lansbury played her in The Mirror Cracked, the world thought of the screen Miss Marple as Margaret Rutherford. Just to think that Helen Hayes was hesitant to take on the role in the mid-80s because she didn't want to follow Margaret Rutherford or even attempt being that funny is amazing to me. But anyway, I also really enjoyed her in the scene where she wants to obtain evidence from Mrs. McGinty's house, aided by the ever-loyal Mr. Stringer, who I think for the first time we discover has a first name, Jim. Both of them are fantastic throughout the scene, from Miss Marple doing exercises in the upstairs window as a signal, to Mr. Stringer preemptively sticking his foot in the door in order to get inside as a supposed salesman. The whole scene is probably the comedic highlight of this one. Stringer Davis is wonderful in the scene where the widow is taking a bit of a fancy to him, asking him to stay for tea. All the while you can see the panic in his eyes at the prospect, however unlikely, of no longer being a bachelor. While this is going on, Miss Marple is upstairs rifling through Mrs. McGinty's possessions, and we get another reference to Agatha Christie on the cover of a handful of playbills where her play, Murder, She Said, is displayed in big, bold font. These movies were not afraid to promote themselves or their literary creator. Mr. Stringer gets more really enjoyable moments throughout the movie, including his jogging through a village in shorts to prepare for emergencies, he says. It's followed by he and Miss Marple sitting together, huddled under her cape or shawl, discussing the case. It's in scenes like that where you really appreciate seeing them this way, since they were married in real life, and appear to have a very good relationship. No matter how brief his appearances may be, the movie gets even better whenever he shows up. Inspector Craddock, as played by Charles Tingwell, is back again, and right from the start, when he is present for the close of the court case, resulting in a mistrial, his and Miss Marple's relationship is a bit more strained than it's been previously. What he expected to be fairly open and shut ends up being anything but, and you can see that his humoring of Miss Marple in the last couple of cases has worn off. It's too bad. I like when those characters are working together, and they do eventually to some degree, but Charles Tingwell plays up the frustration and slightly antagonistic attitude he has to Miss Marple very well. He feels she has finally overstepped her bounds too far, but that moment when he discovers her working at the theater where the second murder takes place, and he's not even fazed by her appearing there, Charles Tingwell deserves all the credit in the world for being such an excellent foil for Margaret Rutherford. One of the similar plot devices brought forward in this film is Marple going undercover, as she decides to join the Cosgood Players, a theater troupe. And as in the first movie, there are a great number of suspects that show up later in the movie, specifically almost the entire company of Cosgood Players. Most of them aren't given much screen time or very much to do, but the movie gives attention to a few of them. First off, there's Ron Moody as Driffold Cosgood, the leader of his eponymous players. He was quite good as the scheming actor that is convinced he's the greatest thespian amongst them. His character is fairly heartless and only cares about ways to bolster attention and money for his productions. Ralph Michael is definitely played up as a suspicious character, the oldest member of the troupe, and constantly seeming like he wishes Miss Marple were out of the way. Annette Carr plays a middle-aged actress that always seems to be listening around corners and behaving in an incriminating way. And Alison Seabohm playing a young actress plagued with premonitions. With that character and a couple others that we meet briefly, I think it's maybe the first time we're seeing more modern, for the time, characters coming up against Miss Marple. In the past two films, it was mostly older figures or archetypes representing Marple's generation or the one right after hers, but it's here where we see her contrasted against this new generation of the 1960s. That stood out to me in a couple of shots in scenes featuring Alison Seabohm, where even the cinematography felt more modern, with natural lighting, more contrasting shadows, and less of the more traditional theatrical lighting. The rest of the cast sort of blended together for me, as the focus is largely kept on Miss Marple and her various schemes to expose the truth. That's not really a complaint. I enjoy her so much that the more she's on screen the better, but it would make it harder to predict the ending if you're one of those people who's into figuring out the mystery for yourself. A great example of the movie's focus on Marple's very involved method of investigating mysteries is the extended sequence where she is waiting to find out who is meeting up to discuss getting rid of her. And that scene is probably the standout in terms of suspense or drama. It all takes place during a thunderstorm, so throughout it we're hearing the crashing thunder, the rain beating down, and the quiet creeping through the boarding house punctuated with incredibly bright flashes of lightning. It's all really atmospheric and builds until Miss Marple finally crashes into the kitchen upon smelling the aroma of cyanide. The editing and cinematography are great as she throws open the door and window, the rain is blowing in, she burns herself on an iron, and finally discovers yet another dead body. George Pollack always seems to include at least one scene like that, where we're taken out of the world of Miss Marple fun and deposited into almost old dark house territory, and I consistently enjoy them. It's also during that scene where Ron Goodwin gives us a really nice, slowed down, suspenseful version of the main theme, tracking with Miss Marple as she makes her way through the darkened hallways. On a different note, I really appreciated the scene where Miss Marple auditions to join the Cosgood Players. Her choice of material, performing a couple sections of the classic Robert Service poem, The Shooting of Dan McGrew, rolled R's and all, was so unusual but so perfect for this character. I loved how the stagehands just can't seem to believe what she's doing, and the addition of sound effects to create the ambiance of the saloon where the story takes place was really well done. The movie does hold true to this series' conventions for the final act, when the killer again tries to murder Miss Marple, and thankfully at the last minute we also get to learn about another hidden talent she has, the fact that she won a ladies' small arms tournament back in the 1920s. She immediately gets to demonstrate that skill, showing off a couple of brilliant pistol shots, the last one taking out not only the murderer, but Inspector Craddock as well. And then another character comes tumbling through the stage to break his leg below, so all in all, it's a thrilling finale. I mentioned in my last review that Murder at the Gallup used the murder mystery as a framework for a great many either character moments or comedic scenes, but I think Murder Most Foul does depend on the mystery a lot more. The revelations and red herrings are important here, and overall the film feels more plot-driven. Focusing on character interactions and moments developing the characters' personalities and relationships is usually what I prefer over dependence on the plot. So in that way, I would say I enjoyed the first two movies in this series more than this one. Regardless what the focus is, it is still important to make sure the plot all works and is pretty airtight, and each of these movies does that very well. It's still a really entertaining film, the performances are great across the board, and that score never gets old. I can't wait for the last one, even if I'm sad that there's only one left. Murder Most Foul comes highly recommended. Thanks for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, check back as I'm sure I'll be covering Murder Ahoy very shortly, but in the meantime, I've got plenty of other reviews you can check out over on Hildebrand Productions. Adios for now.